Hello YouTube and welcome to an all new Elder Scrolls lore video. A bit of a short one today, but I definitely wanted to do this one at some point, and yesterday you all voted for this topic, so today we're talking about who opposes the Thalmor inside the Summerset Isles, or who did previously and has now disappeared under suspicious circumstances. So, let's get into it. So, the Thalmor, the extremist elvish supremacy faction that forms the government of the Altmerry Dominion around the time of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. They form an almost totalitarian government over the Altmerry Dominion, which consists of the Summerset Isles, Valenwood, and through a system of client states they also have the two states of Elsewhere and Aquina and Palatine under their geopolitical control. The Thalmor as a government came to power 22 years after the Oblivion Crisis in the year 22 of the Fourth Era, at a time when the Tamrielic Empire, which was now led by Emperor Titus Mede I, was still going through a lot of reorganizations trying to recover from the damage of the Oblivion Crisis. If you want to know how this whole reconstruction of the Empire happened after the Oblivion Crisis, which is actually pretty interesting as it's something that not a lot of people know about, I made a video on it together with Avarti in the early days of the channel. I'll put a link to that in the description of this video. Don't expect really great narration because it's like year 2 of the channel, but the information in it is still very solid in my opinion. Anyway, the Thalmor took control over the Summerset Isles by claiming for 22 long years after the Oblivion Crisis that they were the ones to have ended the Oblivion Crisis before the news of Martin Septim's sacrifice reached the Isles back in the day. In those 22 years since the crisis, using their claim, they became ever more influential with the population until finally in the year 22 they grabbed power in a coup. They then renamed the Summerset Isles to the independent nation of Eleanor, and they immediately started mass pogroms around the Isles, killing off and exiling all non-elves from the Isles, and in the process also killing off a lot of Altmer dissenters that opposed them. For years these purges took place until there were very little opposers left to their regime, at least not openly. But today I want to talk about those who did oppose them during their rise to power, or possibly could have, inside the Summerset Isles. And talk about what opposition that they may have left or that there may be around the time of Skyrim. So first of all, let's talk about their rise to power, as many people seem to think that after the Oblivion Crisis ended, the Thalmor were immediately the de facto power in the Summerset Isles, but that wasn't the case, because initially we know that the High Elf governments that were present on the Isles were not directly aligned with the Thalmor, and that it was a slow process of years for the Thalmor to become so influential around the Isles with the population that they could bend the ears of the local governments. For example, in the early years when they were still but a political faction in the Summerset Isles with no real governmental power, they were unable to directly exile people or lock them up. But they did have the ears of the people, so when anyone publicly opposed them, like the great seer mage Rhinendor the Bold, who publicly doubted the Thalmor's involvement in the ending of the Oblivion Crisis, they instead blackmailed him to the population. They then shifted collective opinion on him slowly and implicated him in several scandals until the governments had no other choice than to denounce and exile him, as the population was completely against him. This means that until the coup in the year 22 of the Fourth Era, the governments were not yet fully on the Thalmor's side, or at least not all the governments. And in those years there were actually many like Rhinendor who after being exiled became a symbol for those opposing the Thalmor at home, when they were not yet in power and in the very early stages when they were in power. In the book Rising Threat, which is written by Lathentil of Sunhold, we can read that the author, together with others, wished to clean up Rhinendor's reputation in the Isles, and even some of his group attempted to infiltrate the Thalmor, although likely with very little success, as we read in the books that the Thalmor seemed to be onto the plans of the author, as even as his plans were in motion and he was still trying to be secretive about it, he still got assassination attempts. So, especially in the early days, not all High Elves supported the Thalmor, and not just that, there were other factions as well inside the Summerset Isles in those early years who were ideologically different from the Thalmor and likely ceased their operations after the year 22 coup, or they were exiled and killed off after that point. For example, the Pocket Guide to the Empire, which came with Oblivion, the third edition of the Pocket Guide of the Empire, we learn that there is unrest in the Summerset Isles, because not only are there so-called conservative extremists who likely became the Thalmor as Bethesda continued expanding the lore, but the Pocket Guide also mentions a faction which is progressive to the extreme. Unlike the Thalmor, who want to celebrate High Elf heritage, supremacy and history, there was a faction of High Elves which named themselves the Beautiful. This faction, composed in its early years of artists and performers, eventually grew to an extremist shadowy group with the philosophy that the Summerset Isles have to let go of their past in order to move forward. They became a revolutionary group who destroyed Altmerry monuments, even attempting to destroy the Crystal Tower, but failing. And they tried to get rid of the conservative aristocracy of the Summerset Isles, even managing to kill the daughter of the conservative king of Shimmerine. They were quite influential and had a large member base, and were the ideological opposites of what would become the Thalmor, so they must have opposed them, at least in the beginning, before the Thalmor became influential enough to publicly denounce and exile the members, and then kill off those who remained once they came to power through their coup. What's interesting to think about is, if this particular faction had used the same lies as the Thalmor of stopping the Oblivion Crisis and they rose to power, they would have almost certainly been one of the Empire's strongest allies around Tamriel. Anyway, food for thought. But let's now look at the modern day. Who still opposes the Thalmor now inside the Summerset Isles? Well, not that many people openly, most likely, as the Thalmor have had a chokehold on Altmerry political life for 179 years, so anyone publicly opposing them is likely long gone. But as I've speculated in my earlier videos, something has likely changed on the Summerset Isles. While from our standpoint the Great War was a Pyrrhic draw, with the White Gold Concordat giving the Empire its Cyrodiilic land back and likely some war reparations in gold after the Dominion troops withdrew, at the cost of the ban of Talos worship, the banning of the Blades and some holdings on Hammerfell's coast, for the Thalmor and specifically the people at home, this war turned out to be a complete disaster, likely shattering the public image of the Thalmor at home. I mean, think about it. The Thalmor are stated to have gambled all their troops and reserves on a Cyrodiilic victory around the halfway point of the war. If you want to know more about how the war went on, I made a video on it as well, which is in the description right now. Only to then have your main force being absolutely slaughtered at the end of the war and being forced to end the war and give back southern Cyrodiil, which you conquered at great cost. And then likely having to pay the Empire war reparations, if we can believe Preventa's dialogue in Skyrim. Although not everybody seems to share my belief that there were war reparations, even though I think it's pretty clear, but alright. Anyway, after having given all of that, the Thalmor then get the abolishing of Talos worship, the disbandment of the Blades, and some holdings in southern Hammerfell. They wanted that, but then they only got stuck in a 5-year-long trench war in Hammerfell with the local forces and Imperial veterans who stayed behind, which they then also lost, and then they had to sign the Treaty of Stros M'Kai to end the war in Hammerfell, and they then just didn't get the holdings in southern Hammerfell. And they only got the dismantlement of the Blades and the abolishing of Talos worship. Well, yeah, it did give them a backdoor into the Empire if they suspected Talos worship, so they could send spies more easily inside the Empire. They likely did lose thousands, if not hundreds or tens of thousands of elves in their campaign against the Empire, which they only got very marginal rewards out of. So many deaths and likely so much cost in gold, and then only get disbandment of the Blades and abolishing Talos worship. Not get southern Cyrodiil, and also not get Hammerfell after losing the trench war there. The Thalmor have nothing to show domestically for the war, only some geopolitical goals for themselves, but they don't really have anything to show to the population, only many dead elves, which aren't as easily replaced, as due to high elf culture, they have a little bit of a slower procreation than humans. So there's a whole generation which has just been wiped out. So you've got parents who will have to live hundreds of years in the High Elves' lifespan without their children, who would have gone on to live hundreds of years were they not sent out to war. This would have most likely caused for some civil unrest at home, with many High Elves dissatisfied with the Thalmor, even if they can't publicly show it. But with this massive blunder that the Great War was for their supporters at home, and the long lifespans of the elves, meaning that their blunders won't be as easily forgotten within, just one human generation, then I can't help but speculate that new opposition likely has sprung up at home in the Summerset Isles. Perhaps not yet organized, perhaps not yet openly, but there will be resentments against the government which, in the eyes of their own population, likely embarrassingly lost a war, killing off thousands of their own population for ultimately nothing but some marginal geopolitical goals. So even if there is no real organized opposition right now, there may be some again if the resentment gets bad enough. For example, if the Thalmor once again start a war and once again somehow lose it. I mean, I can't really imagine them staying in power at that point, or at least not with the support of the population of the Summerset Isles. Anyway, that's all I can say on the matter at this point. There isn't really much that we know other than that, but I still hope that you enjoyed it, and I do hope that you learned something today. And if you did, I hope you will consider returning for the next Elder Scrolls lore video, likely next week. But before I end this video, allow me to thank my top Patreon supporters, Mr. Bernardo Binda, Gabriel Binda, Polaris Putin, Athena Iodis, King Chris, Scribe of the Scrolls, Doji, Fenrir, Sword of Bushido, Bulge, and Mr. Christmas. It's thanks to these people and all the others on screen right now that this channel stays alive, and for that I am very grateful. That said, I hope to see you all in the next Elder Scrolls lore video. Bye bye.